Jace Fugate here with another session of the Introduction to the Go Programming Language course. We're going to be continuing our discussion on functions. And so in the last discussion, we talked a little bit about multiple returns. And so we're going to be going on that same idea, and we're going to introduce a new type, an error. So in Go, unlike other languages, you do not have try-catch statements. If that makes sense to you, great. If it doesn't, that's okay. But you don't have try, catch. You don't throw exceptions. What you do is you return an error from a function. And by convention, if you're going to be returning an error, you always put that error as the last parameter that you are returning. So let's look at this example. It's just a little bit more complex version of what we were running before. And so we create the previous stock price, the current stock price. We pass those into our function. Our function then takes those in as float 64s. And then we do a check here. We say, hey, if the previous price was 0, that's not something that we are willing to handle. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an error. So we're going to be importing the arrows package. We're going to do errors.new. And then we put in the text that is our error. We save that in a variable called error, ERR. That is, again, another convention that you call your error, ERR. And then you return the default value of floats, in this case 0 and 0, and then you return that error. Else, if the previous price was not 0, then you continue through the function as normal, and you pass something called nil in as the error. We'll talk about nil here in a little sec. So this then returns, we capture all 3 returns in variables. And then what you want to do is you first check if error is nil. If your function or using a function that returns an error, the first thing you do after you run this function is you always want to check if error is nil. And then you do everything else. If error is nil, or if error is not nil, I apologize, I said that incorrectly. You check to see if error is not nil, in this case. You then handle that error in some way. In our case, we're just handling the error by printing. And then you continue through the rest of the program. In many cases, you'll see that this will return. So this will just stop the function, or stop the program, or stop whatever function is that you're in. So let's go ahead and run this and discuss what comes back. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about nil. Let's get into the correct subdirectory here. There we go. Sorry, there was an error. Previous price cannot be 0. If we were to change this to 1, it runs as normal. So let's go to error, or to nil, just for a quick second. We'll discuss nil a little bit more in depth at another point. But we return nil basically just to say there's nothing here. So there is no error. So the default value of an error is nil. You've also may have seen it as undefined or null in other programming languages. In Go, it is nil. And so if you are not going to be returning an error, you always want to return nil. You don't want to do this and return like an empty string or something, because you're going to then check to see, oh, does error equal nil? Well, it does not equal nil, so you'll error out, even though this wasn't nil. This should have been nil. So I'm just going to recap what I talked about here. So you can return multiple returns from a function. And if you're going to be handling an error, so if something in this function can go wrong and you want to be able to indicate that to the caller, you put error as the last return, and then you return an error. If no error happened, you return a nil. And then the caller should capture your error. Check first to see, does error equal nil or does error not equal nil? Handle that case, and then continue on their program however they would like. Thank you so much for being here. We'll hope to see you again.